We are following breaking reports of widespread. I just don't understand how anyone can think that.
Just hours before the U.S. government was set to shut down, the Senate passed a bill to...
Wait a minute. We have some questions.
This is episode 2 of Not the Authority podcast. I am Shendell, and I'm here with my co-host, Sarah. And today we're returning to our conversation from last episode because we had a great question on our socials. And one of the things we want to do through this podcast is allow that collaborative feedback and questioning and come back to that. There's a lot of value, I think, in returning to a conversation and coming back to it with fresh eyes and allowing some nuance to form. So we did receive a comment on one of our reels where Sarah was talking about how a lot of experts that we're seeing online are kind of bullshit artists. And it was really just a great question.
Yeah. So this is from at Rose Char, and they asked, do you think downplaying the importance of experts could be misconstrued as promoting anti-intellectualism? And I'm going to also read the response we posted. It said, intellectualism has been used to obscure harm caused to the working class. There is room for both academic and lived experience viewpoints. And our goal is to democratize authority and move beyond rigid thinking. So we're going to explain that a little bit further here today. And if anybody has questions like this in the future, we could direct them here instead of answering this question over and over again, which I think it might come up again.
I think it probably will. And I think it's really great that this question did come out of our conversation last time. And we heard this echoed in our own homes and among our friends who had watched the episode and listened back. And I think this is a conversation that we're hearing a lot more of. And so, thank you for your question. It's really given us an opportunity to explore the distinction between expertise, authority, influence, and that lived experience that we really want to hone in on. We want to clarify that Not the Authority is not anti-intellectual. It's not anti-science. It's definitely not anti-education. But we do feel that there is room for more voices, and we want to hear about the intellect that comes from lived experience. And so when we're talking about trying to turn the noise down on so-called experts, there's a lot that we are actively internally criticizing and just moving through the questions in our own mind about what forms expertise and what forms authority. And so this really has given us a jumping off point to examine our own thinking and the situations that have brought this forward for ourselves. And we have a lot of personal experience and career experience that has led us to question expertise and intellectualism in a framework that is real, that is lived experience. So really what we're looking at is, when you hear not the authority and we're thinking about expertise versus authority, expertise and authority are not the same thing. So a lot of times we're finding that the media rewards certainty, confidence, sound bites. Most people aren't listening to a whole conversation. They're just listening to pivotal moments within a conversation, and that's what's being highlighted and made loud in the world. And there's a lot more behind the scenes of a soundbite that we think deserves some recognition as well.
Yeah, so part of what we're going to try to do in this episode is examine what an expert is, and we're going to try to explain how we're trying to think about the language around expertise and authority and how maybe we could use that differently to be more inclusive instead of exclusive. I'll also bring up an example of a post that I saw online, saying that we need to bring back intellectual elitism and, mommy bloggers with ChatGPT just aren't it. And we think that there's a way to, I think check our own thinking and biases around what we consider intellectual and who an expert is and where their bias may be coming from, and find ways for, people who are into intellectualism to critically think this through a little bit better, and also not throw out everybody else's perspectives with the bathwater. So we'll be discussing that a little bit as
Yeah.
well.
And I think that this is like really valid for where we're at in a place as a society. We've seen a lot of people who don't have official knowledge or don't have really knowledge of anything put into high positions in our government, and in even in major corporations that are making big decisions, that don't have the knowledge or the expertise that most people believe should be held in those situations. And so I can understand it. I've definitely been involved in this conversation about like, man, we really need to bring intellectualism and back into the conversation. But I feel like the problem with this is that elitism, right? And this is what we were talking about last episode when we were talking about there are a lot of voices in our society that have been put down and have been muffled and silenced because they couldn't reach a certain point of recognition of being valid. And I think that's really one of the biggest problems is so we have a lot of people who don't necessarily have expertise in what they are talking about, making a lot of decisions and also influencing the conversations that we're having. And from my perspective, as somebody who is leaving corporate marketing, one of the things that I see all the time that I think most people maybe aren't aware of is that general conversations and awareness are being led by marketing. And so marketing comes into the picture a lot sooner than a lot of us realize. We end up with products in front of our face and we can recognize, oh, this person's advertising a certain product. But really before a product is even made, you have organizations, companies, ingredient sellers who are hiring nutritionists and dermatology professionals, doctors and nurses with platforms to begin selling the ideas and the concerns that then create a market for that thing to exist in. And the fact that ideas and narratives and perspectives are being sold and packaged to us every single day, I think has kind of led to a sort of disassociation of what true understanding is and where it can come from.
Yeah. And before we move on, I'm glad you brought up corporate, but one of the reasons that I have personally for being here is I only spent about 6 years in corporate, but one of the things I learned is that the people making the decisions are not the people doing the work, right? And those decisions often negatively affect the people doing the work. And they also negatively affect, completion of the goal, right? And so it's easy to get somebody that we call an expert or a talking head who's has some sense of credential or authority that can spout all these ideas off, and the people are like, oh, that's great, but what we really need to be doing is making sure that the people who are actually building the things have just as much of a voice too, right? And because the vision doesn't always match up with reality, and I would like to see us all get to somewhere closer in the middle there.
Yeah, I
But
think that's where the bridge building really needs to occur is we have people at the top who are dictating ideals downward to people who are really doing the work. And there's often a mismatch between not only like what's possible to build in our world, but what it takes to actually get from point A to point B. And the conversations that we want to have here need to be centered, I believe, on the people who are doing the work because they have the framework and the understanding of where we're at and what they're facing every single day. And the people who are focused more on theory or overall objectives a lot of times have a disconnect between that reality and the idealism behind it. And so when we say we want to be talking to the people whose voices we don't hear, that's what we're talking about. We want to talk to the people who are actually doing the work, who know the systems in and out, and aren't just looking at things from a theoretical perspective.
Yeah, and this ties back into, part of our first conversation where we were talking about resources as well, right? Because we want to talk to the people who generally are under resourced in order to do the work that they're trying to do and figure out how to get them more resources because they know what they need, right? And sometimes people at the top of the hierarchy will shift a lot of those resources over for their own goals and still expect, a project to get done, but we need to make sure that everybody is having what they need and being heard. And, I would really like to see a lot of those resources be redistributed more fairly in our society. That is one of the major goals of this podcast. And it also applies to this conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that resources is a really important thing for us to touch on too when it comes to analyzing expertise, right? Because we live in a world that is really built or has been built on the foundations of logic and science and what the facts can prove, which is great. Like we need the scientific process. Like absolutely, we need to have that process of examining our hypothesis and asking questions and testing it. But when it comes to what is being funded as far as research goes, the resources really do tell a story. And that's the other thing that I think I would like to acknowledge, is that as the internet has given us more resources to do our own research and to look into things on our own, you have the opportunity to just see like buckets on top of buckets of published research. And so a lot of what I see are people sort of picking and pulling research that they find and saying this aligns with what I'm thinking and I'm going to, push this forward. There's a published research paper here, so this is fact and this is truth. And that's part of the story. But every piece of research that we get is funded sometimes by, medical organizations, sometimes by think tanks, sometimes by corporate interests, a lot of times by corporate interests. And, I personally have the experience of working with companies who have funded university level research to test their products and have gotten test results that really amp up the benefits of those products. But even in that process, so for this particular example, this company looked at the research and they said, this isn't true. Like, this isn't actually accurate for what we're seeing in the field in large scale numbers, but it was what the researchers were able to prove on a small scale. And they said, please don't publish this. We know that this isn't true. And the university came back and they said, we have to publish now. Our timelines are up. Our funding requires us to publish. This is what our findings were. And now those are out there and these are false. These are false claims, but somebody else will come back and retest it and they'll continue that conversation. And so that is part of the research process, but it has to continue from there. And a lot of what I've been seeing more recently is people pulling articles from unfinished work. And so I think just acknowledging that number one, funding and resources plays into the conclusions that research can get, because that funding comes with a certain set of questions that people are looking at. And sometimes those set of questions are very narrow and it kind of creates a tunnel vision of what the scientists are looking at. And it's not to say that they aren't doing honest work or that they aren't really putting their full abilities into the research or that they aren't looking at as much of the picture as they think they should be. But the questions from the funders are determining what they're looking at. And so it kind of creates blind sides And I think it's just something for the general public to be aware of in that zone. So even though we live in a world that has allowed us to build so much from an intellectual base and to be able to do incredible research, we have to remember the humanity in that and the larger effects, really, that individual perspective and the channel and the questions that you're given can have on that effect.
I agree. And I don't know too much about statistics, but the one thing I do know is that they can be massaged pretty easily, right? So, we have to keep that in mind. And another example I'd like to bring up that I think might make it really clear to everyone, and it kind of seems a little bit ridiculous today, but, back then it wasn't. Doctors used to promote cigarettes and they would have full page ads saying, like, doctors say it's really healthy to smoke, and the tobacco industry, came up with a bunch of research to support that, and there's a whole ecosystem behind it. And we all know today, just by seeing what happened to all of the people that died from smoking cigarettes, that maybe it's not healthy. But we need to apply that thinking to how we're evaluating things today as well. And maybe something that a doctor says is super healthy actually isn't. One thing that has always bothered me has been the campaign to try to get people to drink a glass of wine a day for heart health, right? Heart health. Okay, hopefully I said that right. I can't hear very well.
You did.
Okay, cool. But, I think anybody who has tried drinking a glass of wine a day, if you aren't into doing that on a regular basis, has realized that it makes you feel like shit. And it probably isn't good for our health. And, over the past 20 years, there's been a huge push to try to, get the benefit of grapes or whatever without eating some grapes. And, I think people who want to drink wine can point to that and say, this supports, like red wine maybe is healthier than vodka. And that's cool.
Right.
We should have the information out. But, I had a friend whose elderly mother started drinking red wine, like kind of heavily because she thought that it had health benefits. And, what's my word against a doctor, when I'm saying maybe that's not such a good idea. But I think, that can make us look at the whole thing and say that, maybe some people just, who question some things that come out of established sources aren't all stupider than a doctor and I think we need to change our thinking about that a little bit.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that that's a really good example because it points out how, if you're looking for a benefit, like there's usually one to be found, but that doesn't negate all of the other potential negative effects. And I think that we can apply that to systems thinking as well. And we discussed this a little bit last time as well, and understanding that nothing is going to be a one size fits all solution, whether, we're looking at like our bodies or we're looking at utility works or we're looking at social programs or even, obviously morality. There's so many things that we can get zeroed in on and not see the bigger picture on. And I think that we're really interested in seeing the bigger picture. We know that there's more out there and more to be learned and more to be gleaned from the ideas and the voices that have been muffled or silenced. And we want to see that bigger picture. So while, yes, we are calling out so-called experts and saying like, hey, some of this is bullshit. It doesn't mean that we don't want to hear from some of it, but we also want to hear the other side of the story because we know that there's more. And I think that is really the biggest thing. We talked about a little bit before this, Sarah and I were discussing our thoughts on this episode. And, we came back to the concepts of analyzing education versus application. And we were talking about our own experience in higher education and university work and the demands of a degree, of needing a degree to have any sort of experience or authority to get hired in certain fields, when really like neither one of us really felt prepared for any of the work that we did through our degrees. And it's not necessarily because the institutions failed us, but because often real world environments are changing so rapidly that curricula and education can't really evolve to meet them. And so the majority of what education is covering is theoretical. And when you get into the real world, it's different. And that it sort of speaks to what Sarah was talking about earlier about being in a more corporate environment where you have the talking heads at the top that are, sort of demanding down expectations onto people who are doing the real work, and their expectation doesn't meet the real thing. But we want to analyze the credentialism there. We want to be thinking about the difference in the perspective between the people who we bring in. So if we bring in somebody who's talking about social issues from a like doctorate background who works more in that higher education field, they're going to be able to give us a larger framework of a more generalized framework and more generalized understanding versus, us bringing in people who are maybe working with unhoused populations on the day-to-day and really understand the needs of those people and the way that society is interacting with them and the changes that need to be made on the ground. And so when we come in here and we're saying this podcast is not the authority, it's because we understand that the authority lives within all of us. And unless we're willing to see all of those perspectives, we're not really building a framework that gets us to the point where we're fully informed.
Yeah. And we don't have all the answers right now. This is our starting point, but this process is including us learning about how to better evaluate this kind of stuff with all of you as well. And I think that one of the major problems that we're all having right now is that we're desperate for an authority and we're desperate for an expert to come in and tell us what the actual truth is instead of learning how to find that out for ourselves. And this is going to become a much bigger issue moving forward with AI and people not being able to tell what is the truth and what is not the truth. And what we're discussing right now really is just going based off of the past at this point. With the, rise of news pundits and, opinions and biased news sources. That's still a problem moving forward, but is also kind of a problem of the past because we're just going to have deep fakes everywhere. And we're going to together learn how to find sources that we can crowdsource verification for and hopefully, work together to build up some trusted platforms, that are harmonious and people with different viewpoints can all come to get accurate information, or if they question something, say something without being attacked. And we can all learn how to evaluate this together, and we can all work together to help ourselves, become more honest with ourselves and each other about what the truth is, because we're all living in different realities right now. But we all also all live together as a community on this planet together, and we need to somehow bridge that gap.
Yeah. And I think it's really important that you just mentioned, like, we're all living in different realities. And part of that is, locational, and different things affecting different people at different times. Some of that is perspective based. We talked last time about how the algorithms are really being used to build up a narrative that people then are living from that narrative. And so, you can have a neighbor next door who's getting their information about what is true and what is not true from a completely different source than you are. And therefore, while you're physically living in the same world, you're living in a completely different reality from that person. And I think that we're seeing this affect all of our relationships. We're seeing it affect, personal relationships. You talked about having conversations with people who are close to you that you've always aligned with on, and then more recently have had trouble finding common ground with. And I know that I've experienced similar situations where you just realize, like, wow, we're really looking at things from a different place. And I don't think that that is going to change. I think that freedom of information is really valuable and has allowed a lot of us, or allowed everybody, easier access to information, better communication. We're able to collaborate more with having access to that. But having that many more voices for everybody to sift through really does create just that many more versions of reality that we have to live within. And so I think having a sense of curiosity is really going to become a civic skill, because we're going to need to learn how to reach across the dividing line of our own perspective into somebody else's, and recognize, even though you may have come from similar places, or you live in the same place, or you work in the same field and have seen similar things, we all have individual things that are framing our perspective separately, and we're seeing things completely differently from one another. And I think, like, while there is objective truth in a lot of things, there also isn't an objective truth, because it's completely impossible for one person or one perspective to hold the full truth of any situation. If you have two people looking at the same thing, they're going to notice different things. And both of those things are valuable, right? They give us context for the larger framework. And so I think it's important for us to keep that in mind, that we are working from within our own perspectives, reaching out to all of you. And that's why we want this to be a larger conversation. We invite constructive criticism, or I like the way our commenter provided it. She said she wanted to challenge the premise. And I think that I really, really am open to that, because I want to be able to glean greater perspective. And we can't do that unless we're willing to challenge the premise that we're coming from ourselves. And so the goal here is not to build distrust at all. It really is to build understanding of each other, of the systems and how they're currently working, and how that greater understanding of each other and the systems can help us to work together across our divides to be able to find solutions that are really functional.
Yeah. And speaking of civic skills, this is something we're going to be getting more into in the future. But I understand we all are frustrated with just people just mouthing off all over the place. And there are a lot of stupid perspectives out there, right? But what I would really like to see, if like you think that you have the ability, if you pride yourself on being an intellectual and a critical thinker, we need to raise our maturity level up here a little bit, because we're not going to be able to make any progress in our society if all we're doing is getting angry and lowering ourselves to just lashing out, right? So
Yeah.
I believe that we all have the ability to handle this maturely. Maybe not all of us, but the people who do, I think, should practice that, set an example, and hopefully more people will join us over time. Because, and there are some people that you're just going to have to disagree with. Like, we're not going to invite people with, from our perspective, who have completely unfounded, wacky things to say on here, and just be like, that's okay. My husband likes to bring up Joe Rogan a lot, and people really liked him at first because he would let people kind of like riff on topics that were a little bit more out there, right? But part of the issue came when it, like, some people started saying some pretty dangerous and biased things on his podcast. He wasn't pushing back at all. And that's not something that we're going to do. So it's very nuanced. I would love to see a rise of a conversation about nuance and to see more people practicing that. I think that a lot of the intentional division, that's being pushed by the government and political parties and all of that is, we could see that in our society right now. Like, people are just not getting along. So, unfortunately, we have to live here for a little bit longer. So I guess let's try to work it out. And, we're not going to tolerate anybody who wants to just point fingers without coming with any solutions. And, we really welcome people into our community who are also willing to look at themselves as well.
Yeah. And I think, too, on that point is welcoming in people to the conversation who maybe felt like the conversations weren't for them. I feel like
Yeah.
a lot of the divisiveness that occurs is really like, oh, well, you're not smart enough or you don't know enough to speak on this topic. And most of the time that's just not true. Like, we are all living in this world. We all have noticed things. We all have a perspective that I think is valuable. If only even in just being like, oh, now I know there's somebody here who thinks like that. Like, that's an important thing to be aware of, as to be like, okay, yeah, that perspective is completely different. I've found myself a lot over the last 6 years just being like, wow, like I could not have seen this from that perspective because I just don't think like that. And I think that even in our intro, we have like a soundbite of somebody being like, I just don't understand how somebody can think like that. Right. And it's really easy for us to get into that framework of othering people who hold a perspective that is very different than ours. And aside from, people who just don't have anything that's grounded in anything productive, as Sarah was talking about a moment ago, I think it's really valuable for us to understand the things that are completely different and completely outside of our framework, because we are living in a world with those people who have needs and desires, and their voice counts just as much. But to speak to the maturity of it, we can frame things within a manner that is not directed in hate, that is directed in respect. We talked about this last time again, too. Just respecting people for their humanity, I think, is a really important thing. And so, our little cue line for this podcast is we have questions. And so one of the things we thought that we could bring to everybody when validating or their own sources, or just to let you know how, we're validating our sources, is to bring you into this concept of the questions that we think we could ask that might be helpful.
I would also like to be honest about my own bias here and my own agenda in doing this podcast, right? So, part of the additional reason why we're focusing on systems and why we mentioned, underserved voices right out the gate is because, at least from my perspective, and not everybody is here with me, but hopefully this will be there for them when they get here. The systems in the United States right now are failing. And we got an example of that during COVID, where the supply chains were down. There's a lot of really crazy stuff happening that is jeopardizing, food security, energy security, human rights, and we could go on, right? But one of the things that I realized, as much as I consider myself an intellectual and I can sit here and pontificate on, the causes behind all of this, I don't actually have the real world skills to do anything about it. And I am a person who has spent a lot of my life, I do love to work with my hands as well as the book learning, right? I garden, I have learned how to build stuff, but I don't know how to fix an engine. I don't know how water treatment plants work. I don't know how to set up solar arrays. I don't know how to farm on a large scale. I don't know how to fix our water supply. There are people out here who do, and quite frankly, they don't really want to talk to a lot of people on the left because of how rude and dismissive, the conversation has been. So I would like, we need them. We
Yeah.
need these people who actually have real world skills, and we need them to come together with the intellectuals who can explain maybe some of the theory behind it, or connect some dots maybe that, are not being connected, and hopefully we can all learn from each other. It sounds like a pipe dream, but the goal of this podcast is not to sit here and just talk about this stuff
No.
over and over again and do nothing else. The goal of this podcast is to get real world projects funded and built that will help the future of this country if our government is not going to do it for us. So I want to be honest about that. And as we consider ourselves intellectuals, we can talk around that all day long, right? Which is why we know how to be suspicious of what some people are saying sometimes. There is a coded type of passive language that is associated with white supremacy
Mm.
that, it perpetuates a lot of harm. And, uh, we want to, I think, be elegant about how we say things. But I think there's also a time and place just to say it. So I think we're going to try to combine those tactics, see how it works, and invite some people that we just don't talk to on a daily basis into the conversation and see where it goes.
Yeah. And I think I would like to challenge our listeners who are used to really hearing from things from a more intellectual framework to be open to hearing from everyday people who speak in everyday terms with everyday cadence, because we want this opened up to everybody, because we're hoping to be able to collect resources that can serve everybody. And yeah, it's super important for me that this is a project that can continue to roll under its own weight, in the sense that it will be able to evolve to serve everybody in a different way and in a different capacity. Um, yeah.
Yeah. I think, one thing I would also like to put out there for people who consider themselves smart is to really question, your need to feel that way. Do you need to feel superior to somebody else because you're smarter? And maybe let's try to learn how to set that aside and, um, really value what somebody else has to bring to the table, and you can contribute your perspective. But right now I think we're not trying to feed ego here. We're trying to basically save the planet. And a lot of people disagree with me with, how I might be framing that in such a dire perspective, but I would not be here if we were not there. I'd be probably sitting
Yeah.
in some corporate office building AI data centers like I was doing. But you know what? We're out of time. And that's the perspective that I hold.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that, when we talk about the kinds of questions that we can ask or that we want to ask, I think we have to look at questioning ourselves. And so one of the things, like the questions I'm going to be asking myself is why do I find this source or this person convincing? Is it because of the way that they're speaking? Is it because of their background? Is it because, it just resonates with me? Or is it serving a confirmation of my own bias, and I really want to look at those things within me that limit my understanding. Um, am I seeking understanding of another person, of something I don't have a framework on that can actually serve me or serve anybody else? Or am I just seeking validation for something that I hold? And I think we need to build a bridge between those two things. And I think going forward, I'd like to ask people and get some real answers about what would change your mind. What does it take for you to change your mind about something? Not necessarily so that you can actively just be changing your mind all the time, but to like really understand within yourself what frames your worldview and what you're holding on to so tightly. And I think that a lot of what we'll find is that a lot of that has been handed down to us through education, through societal norms, through language that we is playing in the background that we don't even recognize. And I think it could be really good for all of us to understand ourselves enough to understand what it takes to change your own mind.
Yep. And, you know, my final statement on this is that I think that, and I'm included in this is something I've changed my mind about. I think a lot of us think that we've been living in a real democracy in the United States up until just this point, and some people don't even agree that we've moved past that yet. And that's for everybody to arrive to their own conclusions in their own time based on the evidence that they personally experience, right? That's the only way that people are going to change their minds sometimes.
Right.
But, we are moving towards authoritarianism. And I would posit that we have never actually had a true democracy in this country, right? And so part of what this podcast wants to do is, a true democracy includes everybody and it works for everybody. So we need to start there. And this country has not worked like that in the past, in my opinion. So hopefully we can learn now moving forward how to better, organize ourselves as people, with the interests of, humanity and the planet in the mind, so that um, we're not just power grabbing. And there are so many of us, right? If we work together, like we've got this, but we can't work together right now, and that has to change.
Yep, I agree. Um, I really, I think that that's the key for us right now in the starting stages, as we're gathering people who are doing the real work, is grounding ourselves and understanding that um, now is the time for change. Because as you said, like, we're looking down the barrel at this, authoritarianism. But I think that it's a real pivot point, and it's a real opportunity for people to take back their own power. All of us in one camp or another, if we're going to circle back around to intellectualism, all of us have been taught that we don't have any power if we don't reach a certain milestone of expertise, and that we don't have a right to speak in a room. And some people have taken the path of, fighting for that and just trying to acquire more and more knowledge and more influence, and more, climb professional ladders and network to a point that gives us a right to speak. And other people have said, fuck that. Like, if these people don't want to hear me, then I'm not going to say anything. And I think we've spent a lot of time listening to the voices of the people who are striving to prove that they deserve power, and trying to fight it tooth and nail away from people. And I want to hear from the people who've said, no, I'm just going to live my life, and I'm going to learn what I learn, and it's going to be mine. Because I feel like there's a perspective in that allows them to turn off the noise around them and to just focus on learning the thing and doing the work. And those are the people we need to hear from, because they understand how to grow our food. They understand where our water comes from and how to clean it. And they understand what it's like to live on the edges of our societies and to struggle with the systems that aren't serving people. And they know what real help looks like. And we need to talk to those people. And for me, this is about democratizing, as much as it's called Not the Authority. It's about democratizing that authority so that we all can walk in our own inner authority and fix the things that need to be fixing.
And hopefully, I know I didn't want to start the podcast off on such a serious note, but there is a serious reason behind why we're doing this.
Yeah.
And if we're going to, if people are interested in hearing why we're saying certain things we're saying, one thing that Chandel and I have as a strength is that we can justify what we're saying. We're not saying it for no reason, right?
Right.
We can back that up, and we are happy to explain that.
Mm-hmm.
And if after our explanation, maybe some people disagree, we could move forward from there, right? Obviously, we need that feedback as well. But I personally have not felt like I've had the voice that I should have in rooms that I've been in, right? A lot of that has to do with my gender, in my opinion, and it took me a really long time to learn about that. So, yes, just for my own, soul, I need a place where I could say what I think needs to be said. But in the future, I really hope that we're planning on having some more fun episodes too that are not as heavy. And we'll come back to topics like this, but we'll also learn about cool stuff like herbalism and, drag and, whatever cool, creative, community oriented stuff people have built in the world that is beautiful and should be shared. So I'm sorry, I'm going to cry now. This always makes me emotional.
I love it. Yeah. And I just want to thank everybody for sticking with us through this. I think we really wanted to take the opportunity to define where we're coming from, because this is an important project for both of us, because like, for me, it's work that I can feel good about doing in the world, right? Like you talked about, like I can garden, I can do these other things, but you don't know how to fix an engine, you don't know how to do these things. And I think it's really easy for us to feel powerless in a world that we know isn't serving our neighbors or isn't serving our families. And it's scary to think about how quickly these things are breaking down and how vulnerable that might make all of us. And I've spent the last several months kind of digesting everything that's going on in the world and found myself in a place of feeling really powerless to take care of my family, with rising fuel prices and rising grocery prices and a lack of suitable employment. Um, and we see the system breaking down around us, and we see how more and more every day it's not serving people. And I think it's really easy to get on a soapbox and to say, hey, I need help. This person needs help. This is happening. But it's also really overwhelming. And so for me, this project, stepping into this place, talking to the people that we're going to be talking to, is a way to ground myself in the reality that good things are happening, that we can pull ourselves up out of this. It's going to take working together, which socially a lot of us don't know how to do, especially in America. We're very individualized. And so building a framework of resources and of people who really care about other people, and not just from some leftist or socialist perspective of like, we need to make sure that, the talking points, but like the true, like people who actually care and see the humanity in other people and want other people to do well because we fucking deserve it. Because we deserve to be able to live in a world where we're not completely exhausted trying to just pay for the gas that it takes back to get back to work, or to pay for tomorrow's food so that you have enough energy in your body to do tomorrow's work. We are more than a slave class, and we are more than capable of bringing ourselves out of this mess, but we have to do it together. And so, yeah, thank you for giving us your attention long enough to talk through the heaviness. We really are excited to bring a lot more Hope Core content, a lot more fun, a lot more beauty to this. But we really did think that it was important that we took the opportunity to explore this so that people can really understand where we're coming from as people.
Yeah. And please, leave us a comment on social media, send us an email, let us know what you want us to discuss. One of my goals also is to fill in gaps in a narrative, around certain conversations that just keeps getting repeated and repeated, right? And I want new perspectives. So we're interested in what you want to learn about as well. And if you have anybody to recommend as a guest, we're still looking to fill the books. Yeah, and we really appreciate you being here. And I think opening your mind to listen to some of the things that we're saying that may sound a little edgy, but they really have heart behind them. Yeah, so we
Yeah,
appreciate you.
we really do. So thanks for joining us again. And we're looking forward to next time. For now, stay curious.